Hello, and welcome to lesson number 6 in the unit on the Srivijaya kingdom. In this lesson, we're going to be learning about languages that were spoken in Srivijaya. Now, as I mentioned before, in large trading cities like Palembang, in those entrepot cities, many languages would have been spoken because merchants were there from different parts of the world. Merchants went there to trade from China, India, Arabia, Persia, etc. So, obviously a lot of different languages could have been heard walking around a city like that. However, the lingua franca of basically the entire Malaysian peninsula, as well as the Malay archipelago, which was largely controlled by Srivijaya at the time, was the Malay language. Okay. So what is a lingua franca? A lingua franca is a language that's used to communicate when people who speak different native languages come together and interact. Okay. So you can imagine that perhaps you have an Indian merchant who wants to communicate with a Chinese merchant. The Chinese merchant does not speak Indian or whatever subset of the Indian language that individual speaks, and the Indian merchant does not speak Chinese. So how do they communicate? Well, they will use the lingua franca of that area. And as I said, on the Malay peninsula and the Malay archipelago, the lingua franca was the Malay language. So that Chinese merchant and that Indian merchant would have spoken Malay to each other to communicate. In today's world, English is often used as the lingua franca. Right? Say at a meeting of the European Union, for instance, they would likely speak English, right? So that everybody can understand each other, because there's an understanding that everybody at that meeting will be able to speak and understand English. Just as in Palembang, all of the merchants were expected to speak and understand Malay to a certain extent, right? So they can communicate together. And so lingua franca, that is a vocabulary word that's very important for this unit. So please take note of that. Like in the other kingdoms and civilizations that we studied, Indian languages were used for religious purposes. In the case of the Srivijaya kingdom, Sanskrit was the most important language for religious purposes. Why Sanskrit and not Pali? Well, the Mahayana Buddhist texts, or the Mahayana Sutras, were written in Sanskrit. And remember that Mahayana Buddhism was the primary or main religion throughout the kingdom. Okay, so they would have studied the Mahayana Sutras, the Mahayana Buddhist texts, which were written in the Sanskrit language. All right. The Tripitaka or the Theravada Buddhist texts were written in the Pali language, actually. So Pali is more important for Theravada Buddhists generally, and Sanskrit more important for Mahayana Buddhists. All right. So just to recap, although many languages were spoken throughout the kingdom, and you can imagine that, I do want to add one thing here. You can imagine that in places like Tamberling, in places like Bangka-Suka, language, or at least dialect, was probably different than in Palembang, or than the Malay spoken in Palembang. Right? So even throughout the kingdom, native people probably spoke either a different language or a different dialect of the same language. But in an entrepot city like Palembang, as I said, there would have been a lot of different languages spoken because of the merchants who came from different regions. However, the lingua franca, the language that everybody used to communicate, was Malay. And in addition to that, you need to know that Sanskrit was used for religious purposes by monks and also by anybody who, as I said before, I suppose they're still monks, but monks that came from China to study before they moved on to India. They would have actually stopped in Palembang for quite a while, even many years, studying the Sanskrit language. So you can imagine that the Sanskrit language is actually used quite extensively among religious people, religious scholars. Okay, so that's it for this lesson. Thank you for listening.